Common misconceptions about British soldiers. People say, oh, they were from the dregs of society. And service was compulsory. We talked about some of these things. And desertion was really common. And convicts were drafted in the army. A lot of these things were true in the 1790s, but they were not true in the 1770s. A real problem we get with military history sometimes is people condense time periods all into one little bundle, and they just say, well, if this was true in the 18th century, it must have been true for any time in the 18th century. The analogy I give here is think about the United States Army in the Vietnam War, and think about the United States Army in the First Persian Gulf War in 1791. Well, so you have from 1970 to 1991. That's only a 20-year period, right? It must have been exactly the same. What could have changed in 20 years? Those armies were really, 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 really different in those two wars. And the same kind of thing is true when you look at the American Revolution in the 1770s and Napoleonic Wars, which started in the 1790s. A lot of historians, unfortunately, will just cherry pick information, a little bit of, here's a thing from 1790, and here's something from 1750, and here's something from 1774, and just bundle this together and say, well, here's what the army was like in the 18th century. And it ends up being useless information because it's homogenizing all these things that are so unrelated. Imagine doing a study of what clothing looks like in America and just taking fragments from the 1920s and the 1960s and lumping them together and saying, here's what clothes look like. You know, you can end up with a terrible mishmash, and sadly historians do this a lot. British soldiers, ends of their careers. This is another thing that I really like to emphasize. What happens to a British soldier when he's done? He's no longer fit for service. He's maybe 45 years old, and he's done that distance of march, like from Boston to Concord and back many times. Knees are not what they used to be. His breathing's a little bad. What happens to him? Well, we'll go, well, okay. We'll get into that in a little more detail in a minute. But in general, I have these 450 soldiers who were in the 22nd Regiment, Rhode Island, in 1778. 101 of them died while they were in the Army. Now, that doesn't mean they died in Rhode Island in 1778. I already talked about these guys have careers that might be 20 to 30 years long. So some of them didn't die in the Army until the 1790s and the early 1800s, but they nonetheless died while they were still in the Army. 43 of them deserted sometime before their military career was over. And that's 10% of them. Again, not all of them deserted in America. Some didn't desert until the 1790s in the West Indies. 2 of them were promoted to commissioned ranks, which was not very common, but 2 out of 450 made it and became officers. 182 of them did the most common thing of all, were discharged from the Army when they were no longer fit for service, and they received a pension. Because the British Army during the 18th century had a very well-established pension system, and if you served 20 years or more, or were disabled in the Army, or for any other reason the pension board thought you merited it, you got a pension. And you didn't have to work again if you didn't really want to. Now, it wasn't a lot of money. It was like Social Security, you know, it was a subsistence level income, but it was a pension. You didn't have to work again if you served your country for an extended period of time. 33 of them got a different kind of reward other than a pension. Once the war began and the British Army needed to do more recruiting, remember I said that thing earlier about all of a sudden you could serve 3 years or the duration of the war? Well, there was another incentive besides that. At the end of the war, you could get a land grant in North America. How cool was that? Now, at the time this law was passed, it said you serve 3 years in America and then the war ends, you can get yourself a land grant. They were kind of thinking like Pennsylvania or Virginia. But when the war ended, that land wasn't available, so guess where they end up? They end up in Nova Scotia. Yeah, most of the British soldiers end up specifically in Nova Scotia. A lot of loyalists were in what is today Ontario, which was then Upper Canada. But most of the British regular soldiers who served in Rhode Island, who took land grants, took them in Nova Scotia. Now, if you're a Scottish farm laborer in 1774, and then this war begins in 1775, you've been spending several years of your career. You're about 21, 22 years old, and since you were 8, you've been out trying to farm rocky soil in lousy weather in Scotland. And then somebody says, hey, join the army, go to America. You finish your career, and they say, you can have 100 acres of land in Nova Scotia where you can try to farm rocky soil in lousy weather. But it's your own land, which would never happen in Scotland. That's not a bad deal, right? You got the same weather, you got the same ground, but it's your own land. So this was a huge incentive to join the army and then serve your time, however long that was, and then you get a land grant. That's better than a pension for some people. And 103 of them were discharged, and so far I haven't found any evidence that they got either a land grant or a pension. That doesn't mean they didn't, that just means I haven't figured it out yet, because there's a lot of difficulty in tracing these records, especially when you have men with really common names. The William Smiths and the John Joneses get pretty hard to follow. And a lot of paperwork survives from the era, but not all paperwork survives from the era. So we get a lot of gaps in the documents that I look at for this sort of information. So this doesn't mean they got nothing. This just means I haven't figured it out yet.
Where do you find the paperwork?
I'll talk about this after we finish the whole thing. Then we'll talk about where the sources came from. And I love talking about that. So we've talked about all these statistics about British soldiers. I want to introduce you to a few actual British soldiers. We're going to look at 5 or 6 men, so we're almost done here. But I just want to give a sense of what kinds of careers these soldiers were liable to have. I've taken all men from the 54th Regiment of Foot, which was the regiment that was involved in the raid here on Fall River. Now I said that a regiment has about how many men in it?
500.
Right, and how many were actually participating in the raid in Fall River? It was 100. So I don't know, we don't have any record that tells us which 100 men actually were in the raid on Fall River, unfortunately. So I just picked some guys with interesting careers. It's quite possible some of these guys were in Fall River.
How many companies in the British Regiment?
A British infantry regiment in America had 10 companies in it.
And how many per company?
How many men were in a regiment? How many did I say were in a regiment typically? 500? Yeah, so 10 companies. So again, the size varied at different times in the war. So we can't just say a British company was exactly this, because it was one size in 1775, it changed in 1776, it changed in 1778, it changed again in 1781. But if you just think of a British company as being about 50 soldiers, that's going to be about right most of the time. Three officers, all the companies are the same size. There's 10 companies, they're all the same size. One company is grenadiers, one is light infantry, the other 8 are what we call hat companies. We can get into that in more detail when we're done. So let me get through this and then we'll take questions when we're done here. First soldier I'd like to introduce you to is Jacob Margus. We talked about volunteering in the army and things like that. Jacob Margus was born in 1744 in St. Martin's, a London parish. His grandfather was a goldsmith and his father was an optician. And his family had a nice business in London at the Sign of the Golden Spectacles. So he followed his family business and went into the trade as an optician. They went bankrupt. In 1758, they moved to Dublin and they opened up a new shop and restarted. So, okay, things were going okay. In 1767, Jacob Margus's father died. And now he is, how old does that work out to be? 23 years old. He's an optician. He inherits the family business. Cool. Well, for reasons that we don't know, because he himself didn't write them down, he chose, instead of running the family business, to join the army instead. So whether he didn't like being an optician, or whether business in London was terrible, or what the story was, for one reason or another, Dad died, family business is done, he joins the army instead in 1768. When did the American Revolution begin? 1775, yeah. Now, when did anybody know when the 54th Regiment came to America?
Summer of 76.
It was actually in the spring of 1776, but you're pretty close. The 54th Regiment sailed from Ireland or England? From Ireland to North Carolina And they landed there. There was an expedition of several regiments in early 1776. They were going to try to establish British presence in southern colonies. They landed in North Carolina. They found that wasn't a very good place to be. They eventually went down and attacked Charleston, South Carolina in 1776. And that attack went really, really badly. The soldiers camped on a sandbar for a couple of months in summer heat. And the attack didn't work out very well. Then they came up and joined the British Army in New York area in the summer of 1776. Came to Rhode Island in December. And Jacob Margus did all that stuff. He was a sergeant by the time the regiment was here in Rhode Island. And in fact, after the siege of Rhode Island in 1778, he was appointed the provost marshal, basically the head of the military prison, which then was the head of all the prisons because the town was under martial law, was occupied during wartime. And he was appointed because of his attention and alertness, which was really cool. But when the British left Rhode Island, he had the choice of staying on in this position as provost marshal, a staff position. He could have resigned as a sergeant, ended up making a lot of money in this staff position in the army. He chose not to. He chose to go with his regiment and back into the field. So he left his Rhode Island in June of 1779 when the 54th Regiment left. Somewhere along the line, and we don't know where, he lost an eye in America, which is a strange irony that this optician ends up losing part of his eyesight. But he kept serving the army until November of 1791. He was discharged, he got a pension, but when he was needed, he was called back into the army. He served again in the, I forgot which regiment, I believe it's the 47th Regiment of Foot, until he finally took his last discharge in 1803. So he served from 1767 until 1803, 36-year career in the army. And this was not the least bit unusual. I show people like this who served 30 to 40 years in the army, and the hard part for giving a talk like this is figuring out which ones to choose, because hundreds of British soldiers had careers like this. George Smith was born in Limerick in 1745, joined the army in 1755 as a drummer, so he was only 10 years old. Probably his father was also a soldier in the regiment. We don't know that for sure, but most of these drummer boys that we hear about were drummer boys because they were children of soldiers. When the regiment came to America in 1776, he was still drumming away. He stayed in Ireland recruiting. 1777. Now, a man who starts as a drummer boy often just continues as a drummer for his entire military career. So British drummers aren't all young guys. They have the same age range as all the others. He's still a drummer in 1779 when the regiment's involved in a raid on New Haven and he was shot twice in the head. One of the balls was able to be removed, but the other wasn't. Now, I don't know what part of his head this was in, but the musket ball stayed in, couldn't take it out. He stayed in the army until 1789, so even after getting shot twice in the head, he serves 10 more years. And he finally gets a pension at 44 years old after 34 years in the army, almost his whole life. And they said the reason he was eligible for the pension was because he had wounds by 2 shots in the head, which were near proving mortal, son of a gun, for which he still suffers great pain, one of the bullets not being extracted. And also he's rheumatic and otherwise worn out and has become quite unfit for further service. So he put in a pretty good career, but by the time he was in his 40s, he was done. He was a drummer the entire time, by the way. So again, he starts as a drummer boy, but he doesn't quit drumming when he's older. Thomas Cook, not related to the travel agency, born 1751, St. Mary's, Limerick, he was a tobacconist. He could not write his own name, so he left his mark. He enlisted in May of 1775, so he was right when the regiment's getting ready to come to America. He was tried for desertion in Rhode Island in August 1777, and the records of the trial survive. It was one of these somewhat confusing things where he was out in front of the lines. He said he wasn't trying to desert. He just happened to be out between the front lines and the American lines with a bunch of extra clothing and food with him, but he wasn't trying to run away. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death, but he was pardoned in early 1778. He continued to serve in the Army into the 1790s. He was drafted into a different regiment. Drafted at this time means transferred from one regiment to another. It's draft, pulled like a draft deer or a draft horse. Discharged in October 1797. He received a pension, 22 years of service, worn out. Now what he's going to do? He's got 22 years in the Army. He's, how old is he? He's 46 years old. He's got a pension. He's got a trade. He's a tobacconist. What do you suppose he does with his life?
Just to the Carolinas.
Moves to the Carolinas. Pretty good thought, but he actually did something that was, most British soldiers in this situation joined the Army again. That's usually the answer to this question, but this guy didn't join the Army again. Oh, well, actually, I take it back, he did. He served in the Garrison Battalion for 4 years, and then he joined the Navy, which was really, really, really unusual, but he did it. And he served as an ordinary seaman on a ship called the HMS Calcutta. It's now the time of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1805, the Calcutta was captured, and he was taken prisoner of war by the French. I just put this slide together last night, by the way. I got this information, so I didn't get as much detail as I'd like. He was held until there was a general exchange of prisoners, and I don't know how long that was. And in 1814, guess what he did? He went back on board another ship. He served only 23 days this time, and then he was discharged because they decided he was no longer fit for service, because for Pete's sake, he's 64 years old.
They wanted
But he kept trying, he had a pension, and yet he keeps going back and serving again and again, and many, many, many British soldiers did this. Most of them served in the Army over and over and over again for careers 30, 40 years long, and they're finally discharged because they are really no longer fit for service. But it's very, very common to find British soldiers who served in the American Revolution still in the Army in some capacity in the early 1800s.
So if you were unfit for service in a regiment A, how did the regiment B decide, open? Are you fit for service?
No, they did exactly what they said. They look at you and they decide you're fit for service. Now, service depends on what that regiment is about to be doing. So if that regiment has just gotten back from overseas and you're in your late 40s, but you're an experienced non-commissioned officer, and now our regiment is doing a lot of recruiting to make up for the attrition from being overseas, you might be just our guy, because we don't have to be doing 20-mile marches every day. You get to sit in a tavern and try to convince other people to join the Army, and you've got the experience of that. So the regiment does its own recruiting, and they can decide that's what their needs are. A lot of these guys in their 40s, 50s, and 60s served in what they call garrison battalions or veteran battalions, which are manning posts around the coast of England where they don't need to do a lot of marching. They just need to maintain the post and shoot cannons and things like that, but they don't need to march around so much. So they're still serving the Army, but they're no longer in the infantry that's getting deployed overseas. Okay, we'll wait for somebody to come in here, and then we'll look at one. And I do apologize for being right near the end of the presentation here, but what we've been talking about is British soldiers who served in Rhode Island during the American Revolution, what kind of careers they have, and who they were as individual people, because that gets overlooked so much. We just think about the enemy, or we think about the British Army, and we forget the idea that there's a lot of individual people making up that army, and they all joined the Army for some reason. Usually we don't know that reason because they didn't write it down, but in some cases we do. They often had some kind of a career before they joined the Army, and then they went on and did something after they left the Army. So we'll look at John Hawkwood. John Hawkwood was born in 1743 in Hutton, Yorkshire. He was a butcher by trade before he joined the Army. He enlisted in 1771. So again, fairly typical enlistment age, and you see some time to develop experience in his career as a butcher before he joins the Army. And he got wounded in Rhode Island, but his wound was not what you typically might think of. His wound was he lost the use of two of his fingers of his right hand, occasioned by an accident killing cattle for the use of the Army in 1778. Pretty typical British soldier. He was a butcher by trade. He joined the Army. Now he's a soldier, but he's also a butcher, and the Army needs meat sometimes, which we don't get from a distributor somewhere. We have to slaughter our own cattle from time to time when we need it. And the Army has butchers, so he's got a part-time job within the Army, slaughtering cattle, and well, apparently he wasn't too clever with the cleaver, right? Somehow lost a couple of his fingers. But he continued serving in the Army until June of 1792, so it didn't disable him too badly, and then he did get a pension, as so many British soldiers did. I don't know if I have one more bullet point about him or not. Nope, I don't. Two more guys, because I don't know nearly as much about them. William Danks was already in the regiment in April 1775. That's the earliest muster roll that I happen to have for this regiment, so I haven't been able to trace his career earlier than that. I don't know when he enlisted. No idea how old he was. He was either English or Scottish, but I don't know which one. And then there's Charles Burnham. He joined the regiment in June of 1777. Now that's when he shows up on the regiment's muster rolls, and for reasons I won't go into, I don't know when he enlisted, but he came to America as a recruit, and he may have arrived in Rhode Island anytime between June and September 1777. I don't know yet. But he was a really new soldier in the regiment at the time of the raid on Fall River. And I lumped these two guys together because they were the two guys who were killed in the attack on Fall River on May 31st, 1778. We know their names, but that's pretty much all we know about these two guys. They're the only two common soldiers who we can identify, who we know for absolute certainty were involved in the raid. And we know that because they were the ones who died.
Did their family receive any kind of compensation?
Did their family receive any compensation? There's a great question. When a British soldier died, his heirs, whoever that might be, were entitled to any of his possessions they own. Now, they don't receive any compensation like a pension or anything like that. But the soldier, if he's married, his wife is entitled to any back pay that he's owed. Anything that he owns, which includes his clothing, because a British soldier owned his own clothing, and any other possessions he might happen to have. A very small number of British soldiers that I found left wills, and usually in the will they just talk about 1/3 of the value of my estate will go to this person, that person, the other. Sometimes there's more specific things called out. A soldier in the 22nd Regiment who served in Rhode Island died back in England in 1775 while he was still a soldier, and he left a silver watch to his sister. Where did he get a silver watch? Well, it so happens his father was a watchmaker, so he may have gotten the watch to the family. You know.
We had that before, probably.
Well, perhaps, you know, we just don't know. But there are a few cases where we have wills by British soldiers. There are a few account books that show British soldiers dying and how much money they still had entitled to their account, and it just says this much due to the heirs of, but we don't always know who those heirs were.
If they signed up, if they were young, they might have put, would they have put a parent or anything like that?
Not usually.
So they signed up independently even if they're very young?
Yes, but the recruiting officer has a responsibility to accept, I'm getting into a lot of detail here, but okay, British regiments recruit individually in England, so each regiment does its own recruiting. There's no centralized recruiting mechanism for the Army. The commanding officer of the regiment gives out a set of recruiting instructions to his officers. Usually these things, there's a number of different ones that survive for different regiments, different times, and they usually say things like, enlist no man under the age of 17 years old and over the age of 25 years old, except, you know, likely lads at the age of 15, if they are well-limbed, things like that, then we can take them, but each regiment has discretion over who they'll enlist. I've got an example of a soldier who enlisted in the 22nd Regiment with no prior military service at the age of 45 and served until he was 51. Well, you know, some people are 45 still in pretty good shape, others aren't, so he was. And here and there are guys who enlist at 14 or 15, but that's pretty rare. So they're of legal age when they're enlisting. You know, they have to ask their parents. Well, no, they don't. There's very little paperwork that transpires, but each soldier has to get enlisted by a recruiting officer who has a responsibility he pays some money to the recruit, an enlistment bounty, and if that recruit then joins the regiment and the commanding officer says, this guy's terrible, we don't want him, he's not going to be a good soldier, the recruiting officer loses the enlistment bounty. So there's a check and balance to try to keep the system working well. Also, the new recruit has to get sworn in by a magistrate within 4 days to say, did you join voluntarily? Are you allowed to join? Are you bound as an apprentice to anybody else? And if he doesn't get sworn in properly, he's not legally enlisted. So it was a pretty legalistic
And they try to be
system.
honorable and gentlemanly and things in order.
Well, the point of this is that it didn't rely on being honorable and gentlemanly. It relied on a careful system of laws and checks and balances, because you can't always count on people to be honorable and gentlemanly.
That's right.
So the recruiting office is trying to enlist men, but he actually has a financial incentive to be good at what he does, because if he enlists guys who are terrible, he ends up losing a lot of money doing it. And that's, well, who wants to lose money at their job, right? So he's got a strong incentive to try to enlist only qualified people. People ask me about the sources, and that's a great question. This thing right here comes from one of the sources. The information we have about the names of British soldiers, most British regiments kept documents called muster rolls, which list every soldier who served in the regiment. Every 6 months, usually, they took a tally within each company and listed the officers, the sergeants, non-commissioned officers, the drummers, and the private soldiers. Every 6 months, they bundle these things up and they send them back to the War Office in Great Britain, which is great because most of these documents still survive. They're manuscripts. You can't go online and read them, unfortunately, but they're there. And I've gone over to the British National Archives and photographed them for my own use. I've got the names of British soldiers, and you can also trace their careers for the most part, because these show when did the man enlist. And then if you look at the next set of rolls, eventually something happens to him. He either dies, he deserts, he gets discharged, he gets transferred to another regiment, something. So we can trace, so we've got a name and something about a career. But we don't know anything demographically about him, where he came from, how old he was. Soldiers who received pensions, actually all soldiers who were discharged from the Army got a document called a discharge, and this thing gives some information about the soldier, and it says he's legally freed from his service obligation to the Army. Don't throw him into jail as a deserter anymore or anything. He can account for himself. He's allowed to not be a soldier anymore. And this gives a little description of the man. It says where he's from, what his trade was, some tell his hair and eye color and things like that. When a soldier got a pension, the pension office kept a copy of the discharge. And a lot of those, but not all of them, still survive today. This is the top of one of them. I didn't have a picture of the whole form to show you, but it's a nice printed form, and it says, and with a bunch of blanks to fill in with, from the parish of blank, at the age blank, who served in the regiment blank years and whatnot. So it gives us not a demographic information, and these exist for between 1/4 and 1/3 of the British soldiers who served in the American Revolution. The ones who got pensions eventually, we've got these discharges from. It ends up being a pretty good statistical sample, because for any given regiment you might find close to 1/3 of the soldiers got these pensions eventually when they left the Army. It's a good statistical sample, but it's got some challenges, like all those guys who joined the Army after the war began were allowed to be discharged when it ended because they had served 3 years into the war. A lot of them didn't get pensions because they didn't serve very long, so we don't have them. So does that follow up the statistics? If I take out the substantial number of men who joined only during the war, were they some different demographic profile than the ones who lived long enough to get pensions? We don't know. So we say we've got about 1/3 of the soldiers we have this pension records for. We do statistics, and we hope that they're good statistics because we hope that it's a good random sample, but it might not be. Soldiers had to sign their discharge forms or leave their mark. You saw I had several signatures here of soldiers. like this one, Thomas Cook left his mark, whereas Jacob Margus left his signature, and he signed it very well. Judging by those, if I can argue that men who could sign their name were literate and men who could not sign their name were illiterate, which is arguable, then I would say from this that about 60% of the soldiers in the British Army were literate, or at least they could sign their names. But I'm looking only at these pension documents. Well, maybe literate soldiers were more likely to go to the pension board and get a pension than illiterate ones. I don't know. So we've got what we've got, and we do the statistics we can. Most of the information I'm using then has come from the muster rolls and the pension records that are in the British National Archives in Kew outside of London. And then other material comes from fragmentary sources here and there, because I'm a research geek and I dig through things and look for stuff all over the place. Other questions?
Any intent for it to be archived electronically, you have to make a trip out there. That's, in this day and age, that seems unrealistic.
I don't know. I did it.
I know you did it, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying, everything is so,
Well, I go
accessible.
to the British National Archives and I think, wow, I got these there's manuscripts. Why aren't these things cataloged? How come they haven't gone through? I've got muster rolls of British Army. Well, this is the coolest thing for me. And then I think, well, in this same building is the Magna Carta, which is way more important than these British Army. They have 1,000 years of documentary records from Great Britain over there. And there's a lot of things that are way more important in the scheme of things than these British Army muster rolls to carefully go through and do all what's needed to put them online. So the answer is, I don't know if there's plans, but I'm not doing it.
No, you're retired.
Yeah, now the pension records are online now. There's some of these genealogy companies, the one I use is fold3.com. They put all these pension records online, which on the one hand is really great because I can look at them on their time, and on the other hand it kind of frosts me because I've spent weeks in England looking at these things not online. And then 10 years later, here they are, they're all online. I could have just waited and not had to go over there at all, but that's the way it goes sometimes. A lot of the records that once upon a time I had to go over and hand copy with a pencil are now available online.
You would think you would want to save that, for future generation. I mean, there's stuff, if there's a fire there, that's going to burn,
the National Archives is, it's like they're pretty. The likelihood of a fire breaking out is pretty slim because this is a very modern, very well-built archival facility, with vaults and they have off-site storage in a different part of the country in case London blows up and things like that. They've got all these things. But again, they're spending money and going through digitizing and microfilming collections, but their collections are so vast that again, what's the priority? Well, muster rolls haven't been the priority yet. Maybe they're getting there. Someday they will probably be available online, but they're not right now.
That is a major source of your.
Yeah, the muster rolls and the pension documents give the majority of things, and there's other stuff.
I've never seen anyone use a mouse like you use a mouse.
Oh yeah, well it's just a wireless mouse.
Yeah, well, I know.
As long as I'm close enough,
I have a wireless, but I'm saying, but you do it well without a pad. You're able to manipulate it very well.
Yeah, do a lot of mouse clicking anyway, so that's.
See, you go to the Fall Herald News, I did some research, you get the Herald News doesn't exist in the city anymore, you don't get house media. But yet you got the Herald News on microfiche there, so something like this seems a heck of a lot.
Yeah, I own my own microfilm reader, for example. That's the level of research geek we're talking about here.
That's great.
If you like this kind of information about British soldiers, I have a blog. The address is here. I've got it on my cards that are in the other room, and it just has profiles of individual British soldiers and cool stories about them from all different regiments, not just the ones in Rhode Island. If you have any individual questions, you can reach me there. And allthingsliberty.com is the Journal of the American Revolution. I'm the editor of that publication. It's an online magazine. If you like reading about the American Revolution, highly recommend it. I've written a few books about these subjects, which happen to be available in the other room. See me after class. Take a look again. If you find this information about individual people who were in the American Revolution fascinating, I got more of where that came from.
No, I haven't heard much about the British in that aspect, where we
Most
did
people haven't.
learn about the Hessians, where they were mercenaries, and then a lot of them, after they were out of service, they just stopped and they resettled in Americas, right, in the community, so.
Well, I'm going to take a step back and hit the big M word there. They were mercenaries. What's a mercenary?
Fight for pay.
Okay, it's a hired for pay. So were the German soldiers, which we call the Hessians, who served in the American Revolution, mercenaries? Well, these were men who enlisted into German regiments in the German states where they lived.
Oh.
Some were volunteers, some were not, but regardless, they were part of the armies of their states. Then their government says, hey, we're sending you to fight in America.
Okay.
Are those guys mercenaries?
No, they were just soldiers.
No, they were
and
just soldiers,
mercenary,
exactly. The governments made this arrangement where the British government paid the German governments what it cost to send soldiers to fight over here. But the soldiers were not mercenaries. They were not getting, they weren't saying, hey, we're going to get paid to go fight in America. They're just soldiers in their armies of their nations. Now, American newspapers during the American Revolution called them mercenaries, played it up like mad as a propaganda thing, and Americans have been doing that ever since. I always look and say, well, think about in 2003 when America wanted to invade Iraq, and they said, hey, England, help us out, come fight with us. Were the British soldiers who fought in Iraq mercenaries fighting for the Americans? I don't think we'd look at it that way. But an Iraqi might, maybe. So we got to be careful about what of our own historical information was propaganda that was developed at the time.
Was
American-
the distinguishing thing the fact that they paid the Hessian princes, got the money? So someone still got paid.
Well, they paid the governments, which in a principality paying the prince, they weren't giving him money to his own person to put in his own private coffer. They were paying his government.
There was still money exchanged though.
Sure, oh, absolutely, there was money exchanged, but again, characterizing the soldiers as mercenaries is a mischaracterization, at least in the modern definition of the term mercenary. And you can argue it semantically, but in terms of the soldiers themselves, they were not getting any special compensation to come over here and fight the
They
Americans.
just had.
They had joined their own army in their own country, and then their country sent them over here.
So the ones that stayed, they were deserters, really, and they stayed.
Not necessarily. Some of them who stayed were deserters. But at the end of the war, some British soldiers stayed in America too and settled here. In fact, there are 2 towns in America that are named for British private soldiers, for example. But we'll get to that. But when a war begins, a nation tends to make its army bigger to fight in the war. When the war is over, they tend to make the army smaller again to save money. So at the end of the American War, I'm going to talk about the British soldiers now because I know a lot more about them than the Germans. A regiment like the 22nd Regiment, at the end of the war, 1783, most British regiments are in New York. They say, okay, 22nd Regiment, you're being sent home. So a lot of your men are eligible for discharge, and we're actually changing the official size of a regiment to make it much smaller because we're going back to a peacetime establishment. So you have to discharge a whole lot of soldiers. So your soldiers have some choices. Some of them are eligible to receive land grants in Canada, so if they want to, they can do that. And about 60 men of the 22nd Regiment make that choice. If they want to, they can go back to England with the regiment and then be discharged there. And then if they want to, they can go and apply for a pension, see if they're eligible, or they cannot apply for a pension. They're just relieved to their service. Or if they want to, they can just leave the regiment, be discharged in America. And a lot of British soldiers took that choice. Now when I say a lot, I'm talking 2 or 3%, which ends up being maybe a couple thousand, but not a huge proportion of them. But when the regiment is ready to leave America to go back to Great Britain and a soldier's eligible for discharge, he can take his discharge in America and stay here. Now, if he was served for 3 years in Rhode Island and he really loved it there, he might go back to Rhode Island. He met some people, he liked it there. There's a house in Newport that was built by the son of a British soldier who deserted from the regiment before it left Newport. As an example, there are descendants of British soldiers who live in Rhode Island. They gave a talk at a genealogical society here, and I mentioned, I pick at the end of this talk, I picked just a few British soldiers, and for that one I picked a guy in the 22nd Regiment who deserted from the regiment, and he settled in Johnston, Rhode Island. And lo and behold, one of the audience members was his descendant. Right? What are the odds of that? But there it was. So some British soldiers settled here too. Some of the ones who did were deserters, and some of the ones who did were not. They were just discharged at the end of the war and chose to stay. And a lot of Germans, same thing. Some of the ones who stayed were deserters, and some were actually just discharged when the war ended because they were no longer needed by the army. Some soldiers who settled in America were prisoners of war who stayed in captivity a long time, and then at the end of the war, okay, prisoners, you're released. Go back to your army, and some chose not to. Well, they get written off as deserters, but the army might not care that much. When it gets to be the end of the war, you're downsizing anyway, you might just
So it's
stop
like,
trying
okay,
so
fine,
hard
so
to
you-
catch the deserters.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're still officially deserters, but you're just not
They're not
bothering to
anymore
look for
because
them
we don't
anymore.
want
Yeah.
that. What are you gonna do?
Yeah. Now, these guys who deserted aren't going to then go back and try to apply for a pension. They really ruined their chances for that. But they're done with the army.
Hmm.
Other questions?
Interesting.
Oh, thank you all very much.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you.